And this week we're going to be looking at systems thinking and the nature of change. We're moving a little bit away from the more hypothetical, abstract, theoretical stuff that we've been talking about in previous weeks, and finally delving into a therapeutic context and applying some of these systemic ideas to the therapeutic interventions that you are likely to do as a systemic therapist in your work with clients. This week in particular, we're going to be talking about different kinds of systemic change and grounding those in the context of therapeutic relationships and therapeutic interventions. I hope that you enjoyed the readings this week, the Bekvar and Bekvar chapter and the Lewis article. Both of those gave you a pretty solid foundation in first and second order change. So this PowerPoint presentation today, this lecture today, should hopefully expand on your understanding of those concepts and help you to begin to see some of the different kinds of strategies that systemic therapists use to create system-wide change with clients and their families when they come into our offices. In the Bekvar and Bekvar chapter, you also got an introduction to some of the ethical perspectives of systemic therapists, so we'll be talking about those as well. So first, let's get right into the notion of first-order change as it was defined by the authors of the chapter and article that you read this week. First-order change is change that occurs within the system, and it's a change that's consistent with the rules of that system. Usually, first-order change appears to be a logical effort to create change. In many instances, this type of change is appropriate and it's effective. So, for example, if you're cold in your house, you might lower the heat or put on a hoodie. If you're tired, you go to sleep. So this is a very straightforward, logical, common sense approach to creating change or eradicating some kind of problem or issue that arises. In other words, first-order change involves doing the opposite of what is not working in order to create change and eliminate the original problem. Again, if what is not working is, your body is feeling cold and that's unpleasant, then you're going to eliminate that problem by doing something that creates a change to the coldness. So again, you'll put on a hoodie, problem solved. The original issue, which was your body being cold, is no longer an issue because of this very straightforward, logical, common sense intervention. But here's the thing. When it comes to problems that occur in human interactions, this sort of logical, straightforward approach to change is often ineffectual. And it actually enters that territory of problem maintenance, if you remember, that was defined by Watzlawick, Weakland, and Fish, the authors of The Tactics of Change. If you remember in the first week when you did your first reading in that book, the authors define problem maintenance as efforts to solve the problem that in fact end up exacerbating the problem. And so that the more one attempts to solve the problem with the solution that they've come up with, the more they actually make the problem worse. So in some cases, first-order change efforts, when they are aimed at changes among human interactions, changes within a human system, actually serve to make the problem worse. Second-order change, by contrast, is a change in the rules of the system and thus in the system itself. This kind of change is congruent with what we've learned about systemic change, right? So we've talked about systemic change being a change in context. So that when we change the context, the problem is no longer a problem anymore, right? It no longer fits within the logic of that system because the logic of the system has changed. So when we talk about second-order change, we're talking about a change in the context of the system, a change in the rules of the system. So we're not actually targeting the problem itself. Again, as we've been doing throughout the term, we're zooming the lens out and we're changing the system itself so that the problem no longer fits in the new context. A change in how the problem is perceived leads to the emergence of possibilities for how the problem can be solved. Okay? So again, just as we've talked about previously, what we're looking at here is a change in perspective. And like we talked about when we talked about the difference between linear causality, right, or cause and effect thinking, and circular causality or recursion, we said that one was not any better than the other. And in fact, linear causality isn't altogether different from circular causality, except that it's a segmented part of the circular causality process, right? It's a very zoomed in, reductive look at the interaction, whereas the circular view is what happens when we zoom out the lens and we take in the big picture. This is very similar to that. We're not saying that first order change is less than in quality second order change. We're simply saying that in second order change, we're shifting our perspective about the problem. We're looking at the problem in the context of the whole system, and we're making changes at the level of the system, changing the context, okay? Changing the rules of the system so that the problem no longer makes sense. To identify a potential second order change, it's important to look at the process of the problem rather than just looking at the content. This is a big key. This is how you know if you're dealing in first order change territory or second order change territory. In first order change, you're really just looking at the content of the problem, right? If I'm cold, I want to do away with that. I put on a sweater, I increase the temperature in the room, I cover myself with a blanket, etc. Looking at the content. What is the problem and solving it at that level versus looking at the process of the problem. Examining the how of what is taking place instead of the what, you can creatively identify ways to redefine the context, change the rules of the game, and thereby dissolve the problem. And we're going to talk a little bit more about some ways that we do that. There are two very common types of second order change that we use in therapy. One is called a reframe, and the second are what we refer to as paradoxical interventions. So what's a reframe? A reframe is essentially a technique that lifts a situation out of its old context and places it in a new context that defines it just as well. This new context, though, allows for new meanings to be drawn and therefore new solutions to be derived. Okay? So let's say that a couple comes in and the problem that they're dealing with is that they can't get on the same page about their finances. The wife thinks that they should save more money, the husband thinks that they should live a little and spend more money on things that they like, such as travel or things like that. And what happens is, where they keep getting stuck, is that whenever the husband introduces this idea that they should be spending more money, right, the wife freaks out, calls him irresponsible, shuts down completely, goes in the room, and they end up getting nowhere with this, right? So one way to reframe this, to change the context of this, is to tell the couple, who right now is pitted against each other, with the husband accusing her of being frugal and uptight, and the wife accusing him of being irresponsible with money, right? And childish, let's say. You might say, how wonderful that the two of you care so much about each other, that both of you are invested in the well-being of your relationship and of your livelihood together as a couple. You, the wife, are interested in you two having a nest egg, having money that you can enjoy together. And you, husband, are interested in you two sharing memories with each other and creating experiences that you'll be able to enjoy together, that will connect you, and that you'll be able to hold on to and remember for years to come. So this sort of reframe changes the context completely. Suddenly, this couple, these two people which were at odds, I'm now reflecting back to them and putting in a new frame, are actually seeing things pretty similarly. I unified their perspectives even though their perspectives seemed divergent. Now that's not the end of the intervention, of course. From there, we're going to look at how does this reframed context, this reframed perspective of what's going on here, this reframed understanding of the process allow for new possibilities for change. Okay? And again, I'm going to focus, when I'm talking to this couple, once I do the reframe, I'm going to focus at the process of how they're communicating with each other. And that's going to give me clues for how I can shift the context. Because the process here is that they are seeing themselves as at odds with each other. I'm not worried about how they spend the money. I'm not going to get invested in coming up with solutions that have to do with their finances, because for that, they'll go to an accountant. That's outside of the scope of my practice, right? I'm a therapist. I deal in human interactions. So I deal in process. I'm not interested in whether they change their budget or how much money they spend on travel, unless it pertains to the relationship between them. So I'm going to focus on the realm of the relationship, and I'm going to leave the finance stuff to somebody who knows about finances. Make sense? So what I'm looking at is the process of how do these two people attempt conversations about their finances? And how do we shift the context of how those interactions, how that process is happening, so that new meanings can be drawn out of this and new solutions can be derived? So my effort at this was at reframing their disagreement and actually placing them on the same page, showing that, in fact, what both of them were attempting to do was to improve their quality of life as a couple, right? And from there, we can find new possibilities that would not have existed, that would not have seemed possible in the old context. So this is not a straightforward intervention. A straightforward intervention would be, oh, the problem is money? Well, make more money. Or save more this month, take a trip next month. Right? That's a very straightforward, logical intervention. Is it wrong? No. Is it going to be ineffective? Not sure. Because it does have the potential to exacerbate the problem. And the problem here is the process by which this couple is communicating and interacting around the issue of money. Make sense? So there's a first order possibility here, which deals with the content of the problem, the finances. But I'm looking for the second order possibility, which shifts the context. And in this case, I went with the reframe technique, lifting the situation out of its original context and placing it in a new context. I didn't lie to them. I didn't make anything up. I framed it differently. I took a new perspective on the same interaction, on the same process, thereby yielding the possibility that new ideas can emerge and solutions can become possible for this interaction that's keeping the couple stuck. To be effective in therapy, a reframe must be acceptable to the clients. Okay? So we have to do a really good job, folks, of joining with our clients, of putting some money in the hypothetical bank, so to speak, of understanding the way our clients see the world, entering their worldview, building rapport with our clients, showing that we are trustworthy, showing that we accept them the way that they came to us. And from that place, we can begin to propose new perspectives and new contexts that they'll likely accept, that they'll be willing to go there with us. The therapist needs to have a good sense of the worldview according to which the clients currently are operating. This is Beckvar and Beckvar. The therapist must then present the reframe in terms that make sense and are believable to the clients. And they're going to give us all sorts of cues to let us know if we're joining with them and if the reframes that we're proposing to them make sense and fit enough within their way of seeing the world that they're willing to go there with us. They're going to give us all sorts of cues. If you build good rapport with your clients, they're going to tell you, yeah, man, you're losing me. You're going way out into left field. No, you're totally wrong. You're not getting it. They'll let you know. That's far less likely to happen if you join with your clients in the first place. If you understand the way that they see the world and the way that they're currently understanding things within their interactions with each other, the way that they're operating with each other, and then from that place presenting the reframe It's going to make a lot more sense. Paradoxical intervention is a different kind of second-order change technique that we use in therapy. It's a technique that redefines the context, right, as we do with any second-order change effort, and it changes the meaning of a situation. In essence, a paradoxical intervention involves prescribing the symptom or moving the client toward getting free from the resistance that keeps problems stuck. Okay, so an example of this is going to make it a lot clearer. Let's say you have a client who has insomnia, right? They can't fall asleep. No matter how much they try to fall asleep, right? They listen to guided meditations, they do progressive muscle relaxation, they take sleep aids, they try to unwind and read a book 30 minutes before bed. They do everything that they've ever learned and everything that they could possibly think of to try to go to sleep. And it doesn't work, right? Because these are first-order change efforts. They're logical, they're straightforward, and they work within the original context of the problem. The problem is can't fall asleep, right? Go toward the content. The content is sleep, right? Make efforts that would make the person go to sleep. But what happens sometimes when you make those efforts is it actually exacerbates the problem. It keeps the person awake more. It increases their frustration with the fact that they can't go to sleep. Make sense? So what you do is you come in with the second order change perspective. You're changing the context altogether. You're changing the idea of what the problem is, and you're actually prescribing the problem. Do more of it to free them up from this resistance that keeps the problem stuck. Because remember, the more the first one doesn't work, the effort to fall asleep, the more frustrated and exacerbated the client becomes, right? And the more stuck they get. So you're going to flip that logic and you're actually going to tell your client, try to stay awake. Keep yourself awake. Force your eyes open. Clean. Get up out of bed and clean everything in the house. Write out your to-do list for the next 45 days. No matter what you do, keep yourself awake. Guess what's likely to happen? All right. Another example would be instructing a client who's embarrassed about blushing to try blushing harder. Taking this involuntary thing and trying to make it voluntary. The effect of these is usually that the client realizes that their resistance is silly and keeping them stuck, and they drop the resistance, and the problem, which was a problem in the original context, suddenly in this new context is no longer a problem. Right? I had a client once who was terrified of going on job interviews. And so his effort to eradicate that problem was to stop going on job interviews. But what happened was his frustration, his aggravation, and his fear grew, right? Because he was avoiding exposing himself to this thing that he was fearful of. So I actually instructed him to go to a job interview and screw it up on purpose. Do more of the thing that you're afraid of. Go in there and make a complete fool of yourself. Answer all the questions ridiculously. Answer them wrong. Show up late. Do everything you can to really screw this thing up. He didn't do it, but guess what he did do? The very next day, he went to a job interview at Burger King, and he nailed it. He got the job. Because what happens when you shift the context and you reframe it is you, in this paradoxical way, is you free the client up where they're stuck. You free the client up from this resistance that's actually exacerbating the problem and making it worse. You're changing the context and the perspective about what the problem actually is. The problem is not the job interview. The problem is the process by which this person is approaching the job interview. Again, when we talk about second order change, we're not talking about the content of the problem. I didn't tell my client to try to get a job somewhere where the interview would be easier. Right? I didn't tell my client to approximate the steps of a job interview, to practice interviewing skills. Although that would be a perfectly fine intervention, it would be a first order intervention. I went for the second order. Again, the second order is not necessarily better than the first. But it just so happens that when we focus on process, the means by which my client was approaching this whole thing and avoiding it, When we focus on process, changes tend to be more effective and they tend to last longer. The example of this that really illustrates it well is the Lewis article that you read about alcoholic families and the differences in effectiveness of sobriety interventions when there's a first order change, right, which is just the person with the original problem getting better, versus the second order change, which is a change within the rules of the whole family. A change in process versus a change in context. When it comes to human relationships and human systems, changes in process tend to be more effective and longer lasting. So let's talk a little bit about how problems are formed. From a systemic perspective, a problem is only a problem when it is labeled as such. Sounds a little weird, right? But here's how Bekvar and Bekvar explain it. I think this is a pretty helpful view. Until a problem is perceived as such and is so labeled, there's no such thing as a problem. Thus, like a system, a problem exists only in the eye of the beholder. The way that we tend to look at things is that interactions, events, relationships are fairly neutral. They just are, right? They're just interactions between people. They're just events that occur. Right? But until the people who are involved in these events and these interactions and these relationships decide and agree that something is problematic, it isn't. However, once they do agree that something is problematic, it becomes a problem. So problems don't just exist out there in the world. A problem is a problem when the people who are involved in it, in whatever this interaction or event is, define it as a problem. And their definition of the problem is the one that we as therapists work with. When our families that we work with come in and define a problem for us, that's the problem we're working with, not our own conception of the problem. A systemic attempt to resolve one of these problems that's presented to us in therapy involves facilitating changes in how the individuals in this problem-defining system perceive and interact around the issue at hand. So we're not necessarily trying to change the issue or the interaction itself, although sometimes we will. What we're really trying to do is change the perception of the problem, change the way that these people interact around this thing that they've defined as a problem. And when we do this, the problem that was formed from these people agreeing that something was problematic dissolves because it's no longer perceived as problematic. That's the key. We family therapists are interested in facilitating a change in context and meaning. I've emphasized this a few times throughout this lecture and in previous lectures and previous weeks. We don't necessarily change problems because, as we talked about in the first week of class, there is no ultimate objective truth about what is a problem. Our clients define the problem for us. That's the problem that we work with. So we're not necessarily interested in changing the problem itself, but changing the context within which that problem exists so that it's no longer problematic. Changing the meaning of the problem so that it's no longer problematic. Changing the perception among the people who come in and tell us this is a problem so that it's no longer problematic for them. And because this is what we do, the language that we use when we communicate with our clients is crucial. Language is the means by which clients give us entry into their worldviews. Think about it, guys. The biggest tool in our toolbox as therapists is the language that we use. The language that our clients use is the means by which they allow us entry into the way that they see the world. So the language that we attend to, the language from our clients, and the language that we use to communicate with our clients is critical. We attend to the language that our clients use to understand how they make sense of the world. With that information, we creatively package what we say so that our interventions are acceptable to them and can facilitate targeted change. okay? Our clients are communicating to us all kinds of information all the time. So as therapists, we're not paying attention to just the words that our clients use. In other words, we don't just attend to the content of what they're saying. If a client is telling us about, I don't know, let's say a client comes in because she's feeling stuck in her relationship with her daughter. She believes her daughter is completely disrespectful. She believes her daughter is completely immature, and she's having a real issue with the way that her daughter has been behaving lately, right? So when we're listening to our client, we're not just listening to the content. We're just not interested only in what the client's daughter is doing, right? So we're not hanging on every word to find out, what's so disrespectful about what the client's daughter is doing and what exactly did she do and what did she do after that and after that and after that. Although all of that is important information, it's not the only thing we're attending to. What we're also paying attention to is what are the words that this client is using to describe her daughter, right? And what is she communicating to us about her way of viewing the world, about her sense of how a teenage daughter should behave in the world? What is her reality here, right? What's her epistemology, right? How does she come to these ideas that she has come to about what defines a mature versus an immature teenager, or a respectful versus a disrespectful daughter? When she's describing the problem, she's telling us a whole lot about herself too. And so we're listening at two levels. We're listening to the content of what the problem is. We're listening to what the daughter has done and has not done. And that's interesting information, and we want to put that in our back pocket. But more importantly, we're listening to what is this client communicating to us about herself, about her world view. How does she make sense of the world? And that's where we're going to target our intervention. Because we're working on context. We're working at the level of perspective. That's where the change is going to come from. That's how we're going to be able to approach this in a second order change way, changing the rules of the system, changing the context that makes this a problem for the client, changing the meaning of this problem for the client, versus just looking at the content and taking a common sense, logical, straightforward approach to trying to solve this problem. And one of the things that we do when we attend to language is we try to manage the stability change dynamic in therapy. What we always try to do in therapy is to create change, to create new contexts and new perspectives in collaboration with our clients, so that change takes place, so that things are different, but we are also always mindful that things stay the same enough so that our clients stay with us and don't reject our change efforts, so that we preserve the integrity of the systems that we're working with, while also allowing them to flexibly incorporate new changes. So we're always working to strive this balance between change and stability. And the truth is, the fundamental truth of every client that ever comes into their office is they want things to be different, but they don't want to change. Every client that you ever meet in your office is going to be communicating on some level, usually not explicitly, in fact, hardly ever explicitly, this message: change me, but let me stay the same. I want things to be different, but I don't want to change. And that's the truth, right? It's very, very, very difficult. Very, very difficult to be open to change, no matter how much we want it. So on some level, while people are yearning, dying for things to be different, dying for things to change, there's also some resistance to that change, because the power of homeostasis in systems is strong. There are constantly outputs that are resisting the input, the new information to the system, and keeping the system at homeostasis. We talked about that last week with negative feedback. So we have to work with that balance. maintaining the stability of the system while also introducing change. Therapeutic change is a process of collaboration, as I said, between therapist and client. Through dialogue, the therapist and client co-create a new context in which problems can be deconstructed and new solution-focused narratives can be authored through mutual interaction and feedback. And the main agents of therapeutic change that we use in systemic therapy are language, perspective, and relationship. As I said before, guys, the language that we use in therapy and the language that our clients use in therapy are essential agents for change. Sometimes just changing the language that we use with our client is already introducing new possibilities and change. If I have a client who says to me, I'm hopeless, I'm totally unable to sustain a relationship with a woman, I might just reflect back to the client, you haven't yet been able to figure out how to sustain a relationship with a woman. I'm reflecting back almost exactly what the client has said to me, the essence of that. I'm not negating their despair. I'm not invalidating what they just told me, right? So I'm honoring stability there, right? I'm honoring what is by reflecting back the meaning of what the client told me, but I injected it with just a little bit of difference. Where the client said, I'm terrible at this, I'm not able to do it. I said, you haven't yet been able to do it. And just my inclusion of the word yet introduces the possibility for change, introduces new meaning. You haven't yet been able to do it, and implicit in that is you will be able to do it. Or just because you haven't been able to do it doesn't mean that it won't happen in the future. I don't even have to say all that. The subtle use of language there introduces the possibility for change. Changes the context of what's been said to me, changes the meaning slightly of what's been said to me, but not so much that the client would reject it, and not so much that I'm rejecting the worldview of my client. Make sense? So I'm balancing stability and change there. I'm balancing what is with what could be. And I did that with a very, very, very subtle and simple shift in language. Perspective is the other agent of therapeutic change that we use a lot. That's really what we're working with, is our clients' perspectives. Our clients come in with one view of the interactions within the family system, and their view is one that casts the issue in the context of a problem. And what we're doing is we're working to shift the client's perspective. Shift the way that they approach this problem by first shifting the way that they look at this problem. Introducing new perspectives, introducing new possibilities for how they can look at this thing that has become a problem. Going back to the example of the client who comes in complaining about her daughter. If we use the perspective of the client as an agent of change, right, we might introduce new possibilities for how she could look at her daughter's behavior. Is it possible that when your daughter comes home at 11 p.m. from work, she's just spent the whole day trying to show you that she's responsible? And when she comes in and opens the door and it wakes everybody up, you might be looking at that as disrespectful behavior. And she may not realize it. Is it possible that she could think that working till 11 o'clock at night is the best way that she can show her loyalty to this family? That she can show her independence? That she can show you that you can be proud of her because she just spent the whole day working? Introducing a new perspective. It's kind of a weak example, but it's one that looks at the perspective of the client and aims to introduce new possibilities. new ways of looking at it. And the final agent of change, the biggest agent of change perhaps, is the relationship that we have with our clients. When our clients see us as collaborators, when our clients see us not as asserting our influence over them or emphasizing our power, but as being open to their worldview, as joining with them, and through a collaborative relationship with them, walking on this path of trying to create difference and trying to seek change, they're more flexible. They're more willing to shift perspective. They're more open to the therapeutic process. There have been a lot of studies that have been done to look at the common factors of what makes therapy effective. And they've looked at different types of therapy, different modalities of therapy, in fact, numerous modalities of therapy. And what they've tried to understand is what are the factors that, regardless of what perspective the therapist comes from, or what school of thought the therapist comes from, or what modality or model the therapist is using, what are the factors that make therapy effective? And the biggest one that they've been able to boil it down to is the therapeutic relationship. Above all else, if there's a strong relationship between the therapist and the client, in which the therapist trusts the client and the client trusts the therapist, and there's a collaborative, mutually understanding relationship between the two, that's where change becomes possible. If you join with your client, if you attend to your client's language, if you understand your client's perspective, and you carefully, cautiously, and respectfully use your language and introduce new perspectives so that you're balancing stability and change, balancing what is, what the client came to you with what could be, the possible change that could take place within this system. You're likely to create a solid relationship with your client, and out of that solid relationship with your client, a lot of possibilities emerge for what can be different. And your client will stay with you as you introduce possibilities for change. At the end of the Beckvar and Beckvar chapter, they began to talk a little bit about ethics in family therapy. You are going to have a whole ethics course throughout your time in this program. And of course, throughout your career as a therapist, you're going to be attending very carefully to ethics as they are defined by the AAMFT. But in a broader sense, what I want to look at this week is the ethical imperative for family therapists, our ethical responsibility, the foundational ethics of our work with clients. And it's essentially this: to avoid pathologizing and avoid the implication that we have access to the truth with a capital T. It's to avoid narrowing the range of health to the point where there is little we do that is not illness. We have a tremendous responsibility to our clients, folks. Everything that we say to our clients has meaning, just as everything that our clients say to us has meaning. Our posture with our clients makes a big difference. The way that we approach our clients makes a big difference. And our responsibility is to approach our clients with openness and respect for their worldview, with curiosity rather than with certainty, looking at their strengths rather than emphasizing their pathologies, approaching the problem as they perceive it, rather than creating problems from our own perspective, our own expert stance, our own ideas about what's healthy or what's aberrant and pathological. That's our ethical responsibility to our clients. Our view of clients and families in broader contexts requires us to be mindful of the consequences of our interventions. Our understanding of multiple realities requires us to consider whether our perspectives in therapy, and consequently the interventions we propose, are contextually appropriate for our clients. This is a really challenging one, guys. This is the decentering position that we have to aim to achieve as therapists, where we're guided not by our personal ideas of right and wrong, not by our own reality or our own version of truth about what's acceptable or not acceptable, healthy or unhealthy, right or wrong. We have to enter our client's worldview and understand their reality, their truth, their perspective, their epistemology, their position, and work from that place. Now, granted, there are going to be some areas in which certainty is necessary and things have to be black and white. You think about the exceptions to confidentiality in therapy, and that applies here. If we find out that a client is abusing a child or an elderly person, we're not going to try to understand that from our client's worldview. We're going to call that into DCF. We need to preserve the health of our families when it comes to abuse or neglect, right? If we know or we hear or we suspect that a client is in imminent risk of harming somebody or harming themselves, okay, then our ethical responsibility is to either warn the person whom they've stated that they intend to harm, or to enact a Baker Act if that's appropriate, to get the person help, to keep the person safe, right? So those are some examples of times, very important times, when we're not necessarily going to try to step out of our perspective and into the client's perspective and try to make sense of that behavior, right? In those examples, we just need to get the client safe. We just need to take action, and that becomes our ethical responsibility. But there are lots and lots and lots of other examples of times when instead of looking at what's going on from our own lens, from our own ideas, from our own conception of right and wrong, but trying to understand it from the perspective of the client and being mindful that our interventions have consequences, that what we suggest to our client has consequences. And we're going to talk more and more about ethics as we introduce other concepts throughout the course of the trimester. The idea is basically that we need to be aware of our clients' realities, and we need to work within those realities. And our way of understanding that is by attending to the language that our clients use, which gives us information about their worldview, about their perspective, and creating a collaborative relationship with our clients so that we can approach them with curiosity and openness, and they can in turn be open with us and help us to understand how they see the world so that we can both preserve that by honoring the stability side of the dynamic, and also from that place introduce viable change that they're likely to get behind, that they're likely to understand, thereby creating the possibility for changes in context, changes in perspective, and changes in the rules of the system, which is the second order change that we've talked about. I hope that this all comes together. I hope that this all makes sense. Please go back to your readings if anything remains unclear, and of course, get on that discussion board and post any questions that you have about my lecture and about the readings this week so that you can really understand these concepts. The main concepts for this week, excuse me for the typo, that should say week 5 concepts. I will go in and edit that so that when you get your version of the PowerPoint slides posted on Blackboard along with this link to the lecture, it will appropriately read week 5. So these are the week 5 concepts. The first is first order change. Remember, that's the logical, straightforward, common sense, content-based approach to change. Second order change, which is a change in the rules of the system, a change in context. Reframing, which is one technique used to create second order change. It's lifting the problem out of its original frame and placing it in a new frame or a new context to create new meanings. Paradoxical interventions is another form of second order change. It's essentially prescribing the symptom, doing more of what's perceived as problematic to change the client's perception, to change the meaning of how they've been approaching this thing that they've labeled as a problem. We talked about language and worldviews, and how listening to the language of our clients gives us information about the way they see the world. And finally, we talked very generally about ethics and the foundational ethics of systemic therapists. which is essentially to avoid pathologizing our clients and to be mindful of the effects of our interventions with our clients and the implications that our interventions have on those clients' family systems or the systems in which they participate. All right, folks, again, any questions that you have about this week, please post them to the discussion board so that we can all talk about them.